Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Canada Alone, Navigating the Post-American World by Kim Richard Nossal. Narrated by Snyder. Publisher's Note. This audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type Canada Alone into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code NORTH, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All endnotes for this title can be found in the bonus material. Prologue. For 4 days, the 2020 American presidential election was simply too close to call. After the polls in the Aleutian Islands finally closed in the early hours of November 4th, President Donald J. Trump immediately claimed that he had won re-election. But, as the ballots were counted over the next few days, his Democratic opponent, Joe Biden, kept slowly accumulating electoral college votes. The end came suddenly, and precisely. At 11:25 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, November 7th, 2020, the Associated Press called Pennsylvania for Joe Biden. With Biden leading in the state by more than 34,000 votes, and with just 62,000 mail ballots to be counted, AP judged that Trump could not win the state's popular vote. Pennsylvania's 20 electoral college votes would instead go to Biden, propelling him past the magic number of 270 votes needed to take the presidency from Trump. As the news that Joe Biden would be the next president spread around the world that Saturday afternoon, political leaders in other countries of the West, allies and friends of the United States, began to issue formal statements congratulating Biden and his running mate, Kamala Harris. However, these were messages with an edge. The wording that they used in their official statements, their tweets, or their media hits left little doubt that these leaders were deeply relieved that Trump had gone down to defeat. Only Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, had anything nice to say about the soon-to-be former president. The rest were clearly anticipating that on January 20th, 2021, the Trump presidency, along with its idiosyncratic diplomacy, its America First policies, its denigration of international institutions, and the president's personal attacks on other world leaders, were all going to be a thing of the past. Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, probably spoke for most Western leaders when she tweeted, "Welcome back, America." Nowhere was that relief more keenly felt than in Ottawa. The Liberal government of Justin Trudeau had spent 4 years trying hard to manage Trump's attacks on the international order, on Canadian economic interests, and, as concerning, on Canadian politicians. Trump had come to office with a deep skepticism about America's alliances. He was a confirmed protectionist. He strongly believed that countries like Canada were just pretending to be friends and allies, while eagerly ripping off long-suffering Americans through unfair trading practices and refusing to spend enough on defense. Trump had come to the White House in January 2017, convinced that the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed by Canada, Mexico, and the United States in 1993, was a disaster, a catastrophe, and a nightmare. He repeated his signature description of NAFTA as the worst trade deal ever made on numerous occasions, and promised during the 2016 election campaign that as president, he would either renegotiate the agreement or just break it. Trump was as good as his word. His administration arbitrarily imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, using a provision in American law that allows the president to levy duties on imports that are deemed to threaten American national security. The idea that Canada posed a national security threat to the United States was, of course, absurd, but it fit well with Trump's protectionist views, and his administration successfully renegotiated a new trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. When he signed it into law in January 2020, Trump proclaimed that he was ending the NAFTA nightmare, even though the new agreement looked very similar to the nightmare it was replacing. But Trump could point to the concessions that both Canada and Mexico had agreed to as the price for maintaining access to the United States market. And he could also point to the new name he had given it, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which symbolically made no mention of free trade, but also, in a nod to Trump's America First agenda, listed the United States first. The other signatories responded to this name gamesmanship by playing the same game with the bizarre result that the new agreement goes by different legal names in each of the three countries. It is USMCA for Americans, but TMEC, Tratado entre México, Estados Unidos y Canadá, in Mexico, and CUSMA, Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, and ACEUM, Accord Canada-États-Unis-Mexique, in Canada. As important was the deterioration in the personal relationship between Trump and Trudeau. While personal relations between American presidents and Canadian prime ministers have sometimes been marked by disagreements over policy or by personality clashes, the public expression of Trump's anger at Trudeau marked a distinct historical departure. The low point came in June 2018, when the president, annoyed at a comment that Trudeau had made at a press conference about American tariffs, mean-tweeted that the prime minister was very dishonest and weak. In December 2019, when Trudeau was caught on a hot mic laughing about Trump with other leaders at a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, summit in London, the president responded by calling Trudeau two-faced. But Trudeau was not the only target of Trump's anger. In September 2018, the president also criticized Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister, telling supporters at a fundraiser that she hated America and calling her a nasty woman. Given how fraught the Canada-United States relationship became during the Trump presidency, it is hardly surprising that Trudeau's formal message of congratulations was framed in traditional hands-across-the-border rhetoric. Canada and the United States enjoy an extraordinary relationship, one that is unique on the world stage. Our shared geography, common interests, deep personal connections, and strong economic ties make us close friends, partners, and allies. But Trudeau also evoked all those policy issues that had been spurned by Trump. We will further build on this foundation as we continue to keep our people safe and healthy from the impacts of the global COVID-19 pandemic and work to advance peace and inclusion, economic prosperity, and climate action around the world. After Biden was inaugurated on January 20, 2021, Trudeau was the first leader to have a substantive telephone conversation with the new president. They discussed a range of policy issues: collaboration on vaccines, action on climate change and net zero emissions, expanded cooperation on continental defense, and the modernization of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. They discussed the cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, two Canadians arrested in China in retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, chief financial officer of Huawei Technologies, on an extradition request by the United States. They talked about trade, supply chain resilience, and barriers to trade. Trudeau expressed his concern about the American refusal to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. A month later, the two leaders had their first summit meeting, accompanied by Vice President Kamala Harris and Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, together with Antony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, and Marc Garneau, Canada's Foreign Minister. Because of COVID-19, it was a virtual meeting. In their introductory prepared remarks delivered in front of the media, Biden and Trudeau stressed the importance of working together on global issues. Indeed, Trudeau went out of his way to praise the Biden administration's policy toward climate change. "Thank you again for stepping up in such a big way on tackling climate change," he said. U.S. leadership has been sorely missed over the past years, and I have to say, as we're preparing the joint rollout and communique from this one, it's nice when the Americans are not pulling out all references to climate change and instead adding them in. The meeting ended with the adoption of a 12-page roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership that outlined how a range of cross-border issues would be dealt with. This virtual summit meeting very much reflected the priority that the Biden administration attached to returning the Canadian-American relationship to a degree of civility and predictability that had been so absent during the Trump years, and presaged its broader efforts to undo the damage that Trump had done to relations with America's friends and allies. But the meeting was also notable for how different it was from the previous administration. Here were political leaders who delivered carefully scripted statements. They focused on important policy issues. Agreements had been reached by bureaucrats on both sides of the border who spent time prior to the summit working out agreed-upon language. They discussed points of disagreement between their two governments civilly and with a view to resolving differences. They stressed jointness, cooperation, and alignment. Perhaps that is why a common reaction of officials in Ottawa was happiness at just how normal this summit was after 4 years of craziness, and profound relief that the United States was back. Introduction. The Liberal government of Justin Trudeau might well have breathed a collective sigh of relief when Joe Biden was inaugurated as the 46th U.S. President in 2021. It seemed like American foreign policy would be more or less back to normal. For under Biden, America is indeed back in global politics. Biden's foreign policy instincts are what students of the discipline of international relations call internationalist. In other words, he believes that countries should best defend their interests in world politics by being actively engaged, rather than seeking isolation and withdrawal. He believes in multilateralism, the idea that the United States should work with others, in particular its friends and allies, to solve global problems. He believes in America's alliances and values those allies. He believes in the idea of American leadership in global politics. And his administration is run by senior officials who are expert foreign affairs professionals and committed not only to a particular conception of world order, but also, like their boss, to the importance of exercising global leadership to maintain it. The Trudeau government's foreign policy reflected this return to normality. The government in Ottawa sought to work with the Biden administration at a multilateral level on a range of issues, including climate change and pandemic response. Ottawa welcomed the leadership shown by the Biden administration in rallying the West's response to the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began in February 2022. In the fall of 2022, the Trudeau government shifted its policy to align Canada more closely to American policies toward the People's Republic of China, PRC. It began to spend more on defense, including modernizing the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and finally committing to purchasing a fleet of 88 F-35 jet fighters. It has downplayed the progressive foreign policy agenda that it tried to pursue in 2016 and 2017. Canadian foreign policy today is very much premised on the assumption that the Trump years are well and truly in the past. However, to assume that Trump or Trumpism is behind us would be to ignore what is happening in the United States. The shifts in American politics that propelled Donald J. Trump to the White House in 2017 have not disappeared. On the contrary, the persistence of the trends in American politics and foreign policy that Trump had both reflected and inspired remain very much in evidence. In domestic politics, the Republican Party, or Grand Old Party, GOP, has experienced a profound anti-democratic and illiberal lurch under Trump and his Make America Great Again, MAGA, movement. The longer-term political effects of the armed insurrection on January 6, 2021, that Trump and his allies incited after he lost the 2020 election are yet to be fully felt. Nor do we know the effects of the sustained efforts by the GOP to deny the legitimacy of the 2020 election, or the spread of extremism in the Republican Party in 2021 and 2022. Most importantly, we will not know whether, in the years ahead, the United States will continue to play a leadership role in world politics, the kind of role it played for all but 4 of the last 80 years. Many of Trump's ideas about world politics, captured most vividly in his slogan, America First, generated such enthusiasm during his presidency precisely because they were a variant of a long-standing approach to world affairs in the United States, called the conservative nationalist tradition in American foreign policy. The conservative nationalist approach is marked by an intense focus on advancing the interests of the United States by maximizing the country's autonomy in global politics. That means rejecting any of the limits on American sovereignty and freedom of maneuver that multilateral involvement impose, and instead encouraging a persistent skepticism about international institutions. It also means seeking to win in international affairs. In other words, never yielding to adversaries, always rejecting concessions to others, and generally acting, in the words of the foreign minister of one middle power who found himself at the receiving end of American unilateralism, without regard to the legitimate interests of others. The conservative nationalist nature of Trump's America First agenda was popular with Americans. Its popularity will not diminish. We can find evidence of this after Trump's defeat in 2020. While the Biden administration has worked hard to reverse much of the damage done to American foreign policy by the Trump administration, it has also left many of Trump's policies in place, particularly the protectionist measures imposed on both friends and adversaries alike. Likewise, the Democratic Party's approach to the rise of China as a great power and its efforts to contain China differ from Trumpist policies only in the level of professionalism and competence of the Biden team. The possibility that we will see the resurgence of a conservative nationalist trend in American foreign policy has profound implications for global politics and for Canada, since our foreign and defense policies are designed for a world in which the United States plays a leadership role in shaping a particular kind of world order. But what if we see a resumption of the kind of profound transformations in American foreign policy that began in 2017 and were only interrupted by Trump's defeat in 2020? In that event, those shifts in foreign policy are likely to have more lasting impacts on global politics. If that happens, the kind of foreign policy being pursued by the Trudeau government will have been overtaken by events, since the world it was designed for will have been transformed. The purpose of this book is to explore the implications for Canadians of such a transformation. We need to begin by looking backwards in order to understand why Canada is at such a fraught crossroads. In Chapter 1, we discussed the world that Canadians have been used to living in since the end of the Second World War. That world, the American-led rules-based international order, was unambiguously an American world, reflecting the power and centrality of the United States in shaping global politics. Judging by their persistent political support for remaining part of that world, Canadians clearly saw the American-led international order and the systemic peace and increasing wealth that came with it, at least for some in the world, working in their interests. But we will also explore a key paradox in Canada's case. Over the last 80 years, Canadians have never seen themselves as part of an American world, but always as part of a larger grouping of states. For Canada has always understood that being a member of a larger group offers a small country in global politics substantial benefits. Being a member of a group provides strength in numbers. It also affords smaller countries the opportunity to search with other like-minded countries for multilateral solutions to global problems and gives small countries a seat at the table in global discussions with great powers. And in Canada's case, there was the additional advantage of being able to deal with the United States in this company. Over the last decade, however, the American world has been under sustained assault. In Chapter 2, we begin with an examination of the two broad developments in global politics over the last 10 years that have posed major challenges to the American world: the growth of Russian revanchism and the rise of an aggressively assertive China. But Russian and Chinese efforts to displace American leadership only tells us part of the story. To understand how and why the American world has been so shaken, we need to consider a third development in contemporary global politics: the rise, paradoxically, of a U.S. president who lacked the commitment of all his predecessors and his immediate successor to American global leadership. On his first full day in office, Trump set about pulling apart the American-led rules-based international order by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a free trade initiative that the Democratic administration of his predecessor, Barack Obama, had negotiated. That assault continued until the very end of his presidency. Just days after the presidential election in 2020, Trump attempted an end run around his own national security officials by signing a rogue memorandum ordering an immediate withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Somalia and Afghanistan in order to precipitate a crisis for the new president. These initiatives bookended 4 years of idiosyncratic foreign policy that had hugely negative impacts on all friends and allies of the United States and on the American world itself. It is true that the assault on the American world from within was slowed by the election of Joe Biden in 2020. But the patterns of American politics in the next several years will determine the broad direction of American foreign policy, and thus, the future of the American world. Chapter 3 examines contemporary politics in the United States, particularly the internal politics of the Republican Party and the enduring legacies of the Trump presidency. The broader political movement that Trump mobilized remains a potent force in American politics. More importantly, the Republican Party remains, at its core, an anti-democratic, illiberal, and authoritarian political party, and that will have a significant impact on American foreign policy in the years ahead. In Chapter 4, we discuss the likely shifts in American foreign policy in the future, particularly if conservative nationalist trends reassert themselves. A conservative nationalist Republican administration is likely to have learned some lessons from Trump's presidency, in particular, how his conservative nationalist foreign policy was slowed and skewed by so many so-called adults in the room who tried to erect guardrails against his crazier foreign policy proclivities. But even if the next Republican president does not regard the American bureaucracy as Trump did, as the deep state, a clandestine and powerful group of government officials conniving to thwart his presidency, it is likely that he or she will take steps to blunt the policy impact of the bureaucracy by resurrecting measures that Trump introduced late in his presidency, and that were then immediately reversed by the Biden administration. Chapter 4 will also sketch out how global politics is likely to unfold under another conservative nationalist president, focusing on what is likely to happen in Europe and in the Western Pacific. If a renewal of the assault from within by an American-first administration is added to the ongoing twin assaults on the American world from Russia and China, we are likely to see the end of the American world as we have known it. Chapter 5 explores the arrival instead of a new era, which we might name by resurrecting a term coined by political commentator Fareed Zakaria a decade and a half ago, the post-American world. But this post-American era will, however, not be the world envisaged by Zakaria in 2008. In that world, the shift in global power marked by the rise of the rest relative to the American-led West was what created the post-American world. In Zakaria's portrait, the United States was still very much a global leader, and the West still very much a force in global politics. By contrast, the post-American world that is likely to emerge in the 2020s will be marked not only by the absence of American leadership, but also by the fracturing of the West as a relatively unified geostrategic force in global politics. In Chapter 6, we explore the implications for Canadians of the persistence of American-first ideas in the United States and the likely difficulties that we will have in navigating this new world. It suggests that in the next decade, the world that Canada will have to deal with will look increasingly like the world that Canadians dealt with in the decade before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. A multipolar array of great powers, and a world in which the United States did not have the kind of leadership role that it embraced during and after the Second World War. The world will look different for Canadians in one important respect. In the early 1900s, Canada was on its own with its American neighbor, but this solitude was mitigated by Canada's membership in the British Empire. If the West fragments in the 2020s as a result of the purposeful abandonment of global leadership by the United States, there will no longer be those connections across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic circumpolar region that Canada has always had in the past 80 years to ease the challenges of being geostrategically all alone with the Americans in North America. Navigating a world in which the United States has abandoned its leadership role in global politics will be particularly difficult for Canadians. The political dysfunctions in the United States itself will have a northward impact, reshaping politics in this country in the process. The end of the American world will also have a significant impact on the well-being of Canadians. Without the American-led, rules-based global trading order that undergirded and promoted globalization in the late 20th century, Canadians will be completely at the mercy of an always protectionist United States. Most importantly, an America that is disconnected from friends and allies in Europe and the Western Pacific, and increasingly focused on great power competition, is likely to become increasingly belligerent in global politics. In such circumstances, systemic war becomes more likely. We conclude by considering what the Canadian government might do to prepare for the possibility of the arrival of a post-American world, and for the possibility that Canada will be, for the first time in its modern history, alone in the world. 1. Canada's American world. The world that Canadians have lived in for the last 80 years is often described as the American world, reflecting the degree to which the United States has played a central role in global politics since Americans ended 20 years of isolation after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Sometimes the international order that came into being following the Second World War is described as liberal, but we need to recognize that the liberal order helped keep many illiberal, authoritarian, and abusive regimes in power. And while we often speak in the singular about the post-war international order, there were in fact various iterations of the global order that evolved over the decades of the Cold War and the post-Cold War eras. However, as political scientist John Eikenberry notes, there was one commonality in all those iterations. They were organized around economic openness, multilateral institutions, security cooperation, and democratic solidarity. And all of the iterations of the international order since 1945 were maintained by the huge wealth, the industrial and technical capacity, the massive military capability, and the cultural and ideological dominance of the United States. But that American world was also a result of leadership. U.S. presidents, backed by Congress and, ultimately, American voters, were consistently willing to use the superordinate power of the United States to shape the global order. While that order was unabashedly designed to protect and advance parochial American interests, American leaders always worked hard to ensure that it had the approval of a worldwide network of friends and allies, successfully convincing them that what was good for the United States was good for them, too. The commitment to asserting global leadership was a constant in American politics between 1941 and 2016. All 13 presidents during that era, 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans, were committed to this approach, even if their particular policies may have varied. The American world and the West. One of the consequences of that leadership was that the American world was also a Western world. For there has always been an intimate relationship between the various iterations of the American-led global order and other states of the West. But what, precisely, is the West? We need to be able to identify the West because it is such an intimate part of the American world. Because it is so widely used, we tend to take the West for granted. It is a vague and sometimes deeply problematic way of conceptualizing a particular group of states. There is no widely agreed upon definition of what it actually is or who is in it, much less how one actually determines membership. Part of the problem is that the word itself is highly ambiguous. Because it has a purely geographic meaning in common parlance, it is not always clear that in international relations the West, with a capital W, is generally not a geographic term. Usage has also changed over time. During the Cold War, West and East were used as shorthand to capture the ideological division between capitalist and communist states, a binary that lost its meaning after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR, or Soviet Union. Today, more often than not, the West is just used without further definition or explanation.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?